Lucy Abrahams, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's really brilliant of you to give us time to speak to us. I know it must be a hugely busy time building up to the winter season at glassDoor, so thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I wanted to ask you. You've got such an interesting story, and I know you and I have a shared interest in cricket and all kinds of background things. But you said on the record when you became CEO of glassDoor that I'm interested in how we tackle societal problems and improve public life. It's such a massive ambition to have and an interest to have. But what have you learned about that so far in your work with glassDoor?
Yeah, so to answer that, it's probably worth just taking a step back and talking a little bit about where I came from before glassDoor. So I did several years in small charities, kind of very grassroots, and then went and completely changed career and went to the National Audit Office, where I trained to be a chartered accountant, and I did 5 years there. And really, I went there with exactly this same kind of ambition to change society and to influence government, because the National Audit Office's remit is around holding government to account, looking at policy, looking at how it's implemented and developed. And I did actually some work around homelessness when I was there, and that sort of started to pique my interest as well as a bit of volunteering. But without being critical, I think I felt quite frustrated while I was there that actually, in order to achieve change, it's very slow and cumbersome, and it takes a really long time. So we might have written a report that recommended particular changes in government thinking, or the way that government was implementing their policy, but actually it took several years down the line for that to actually have a real impact on people's lives. And in many ways, it felt very sort of set apart from reality in some ways. So it was really that inspired me to want to move back into a grassroots charity, to be doing something that is on the front line, that is meeting with people every day and kind of really impacting people's lives. And I think what really attracted me to glassDoor was because of the open access policy, which means that we meet everybody that comes to us at their point of need. So there's no criteria for who can come to glassDoor to access our night shelters or our advice and support through our casework service. So it means that the people that come to glassDoor are really the people that society has sort of forgotten about in a lot of cases. They've fallen through the cracks. They've tried to get support elsewhere, and have failed. That's failed them in some way in many cases. So that very ambitious aim around sort of societal change, part of that is about the very positive impact of the work that we do in terms of changing people's lives and helping to give them a path off the street. But it's also about being the voice of those guests and representing their needs. And increasingly now, as glassDoor's sort of reputation and our networks grow, we're able to also represent the guests in terms of what change needs to happen more widely in order to look at some of the root causes of homelessness. Obviously, the impact of COVID recently, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, has sort of changed people's perspectives on rough sleeping and the possibility of ending rough sleeping.
Yeah, I was going to say you talked about in the National Audit Office things being very slow, and suddenly we saw in COVID things that we thought would take years, generations even, just happened overnight. And one of those things was people being brought in to hotels and hostels, and street homelessness for a season completely ending. That I just found an extraordinary moment in this crisis, and one perhaps that we haven't talked enough about. And what was it like from your point of view?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a massive opportunity for our guests and for everybody working within the sector. And as you say, the government responded incredibly quickly to what could have become, in everything that had to be considered around the risks of COVID and all of the challenges. Actually, one thing that could have easily been completely forgotten, was that it's impossible to shield, it's impossible to self-isolate if you're on the streets, and this massive sort of risk for a very vulnerable group of people. And it was brilliant the way that the government did step in and took such action for our guests. That meant, so ordinarily our winter night shelters in churches would operate until about the beginning of April, and obviously there were cases of COVID from, well, February really. It was starting to become a real concern. So we had about 4 hairy weeks where we were taking all of the precautions that you would expect around PPE and around screening, and being careful with vulnerable volunteers and temperature checks and all of that. But thank goodness we managed to ensure that our shelters stayed safe for that period. But actually, when the government took that decision to move everyone into hotels, it meant 127 guests, which was the number that were staying in our shelters. We stopped after COVID became a real risk. We stopped adding new people in. So ordinarily, as somebody leaves the night shelter, we would add in someone off the waiting list. We always have extremely long waiting lists for places in our shelters. And we stopped adding to that list. So the numbers had reduced down to about 127, but still, by middle of March, the COVID risk was so high that actually the government stepping in, and it was actually through the Greater London Authority, we were able to move that entire cohort of guests into hotels almost overnight. Was just fantastic for the guests, both in terms of, the immediate impact of keeping them safe and well in this really dangerous environment, but also in the longer term, it was actually an opportunity, because ordinarily when our shelters end in April, it's more difficult for our team of caseworkers who are supporting the guests into more permanent accommodation, and in the meantime they'll be helping them with things like claiming benefits or getting a job, or dealing with addictions, or even just opening bank accounts, whatever it is that our guests need, whatever the hurdle is that is currently stopping them from being in safe housing. Having the guests moving into the hotels and knowing where they are, and then having that stable base, having a roof over their head, somewhere warm and dry to be, having access to Wi-Fi, all of those things meant that it was much easier for our caseworkers to then support them in the period that followed.
It's really important for us to hear, because I think we will know of glassDoor most of us. Have you lost me?
I'm sorry, I had a problem with my volume. Could you just repeat that?
It's interesting for us to hear, particularly about the casework stuff, because we know about glassDoor. Some of us have done the sleep out, some of us have been volunteers in neighbouring churches. We know about the kind of night shelter element, the coming in, an evening meal, somewhere to sleep, recharge your phone, breakfast in the morning, and then you're out. But the work of the caseworkers, those overcoming those hurdles to being in safe accommodation, that's such an interesting part of your work and such a valuable part of your work. And I can just imagine how being in one place really enabled that to happen in a much more effective way over that COVID lockdown period. But just kind of imagining if it's possible beyond the kind of immediate COVID world, what do you think the possibilities are for our homeless neighbours, and how might this issue develop in the next few months and years, do you think?
Well, I think, as you already touched on, the fact that there was the collective will to come together and to make this happen overnight. And although I'm sort of personally very cynical when there were headlines that said everyone in ended homelessness. I mean, it didn't. It ended homelessness for some people that were fortunate enough to access the scheme at that time. For various reasons, some of those have now dropped out, and of course a lot of people have become homeless since then as a result of some of the economic effects of COVID. But having said all of that, the will, and also finding the finances to do it, was clearly there. And the other thing was the kind of outpouring of support from the community as well. We, and I know other homeless organisations across the country, were really blessed by the level of well, both financial support, but also, you know, people's willingness to volunteer, to help with food, to get involved in whatever way. So, you know, there was already a great will to, I think, you know, amongst particularly things like the church community, but also, you know, the wider community to end homelessness. But I think this has really kind of brought it to the fore. The other thing it's done, so one of the things we've been looking at over the last few months is what our winter service looks like, because as you alluded to, we normally have rolling night shelters across 7 venues in a circuit. That's very much more difficult in a COVID world, and you know, obviously the government is issuing guidance around that. So we and services across the country have had to complete, you know, day centres as well, have had to completely rethink how they operate. And in many ways, I think, while it's been a really difficult period, everybody's been forced to innovate and think about new solutions, and actually to go back to the guests and to really put the guests at the heart of everything, and to ensure that when we, apologies, my young puppy is just barking a little bit, to ensure that we're really including the guests in the design of our services and really thinking about how we put them at the heart. And I do think that having to adapt can only, you know, create change for the better, for guests and for services, and for looking at that longer term view as to what needs to happen to try and get to that point where no one is sleeping on the streets.
And I think it's, you know, it's important to kind of hear you say that and emphasize that you know, that we would love to get to a point where no one is sleeping on the streets. It's we've all grown up with it, but it doesn't have to be this way. And I think it's great to kind of keep that aim in mind. The other thing that, of course, the last few months has thrown up in sharper relief, shall we say, is racial injustice. And I just wonder if, in the work that you do with homeless neighbours, if you see the effects of sort of systemic racism in the work that you do, and perhaps the people you are serving.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the data that we collect about our guests, we deliberately, because we're an open access service and we want to remove barriers to entry, we don't collect a huge amount of data about everybody that walks in through the door, and actually data on ethnic background is not something that we sort of formally track at the moment. It's something that's under review for us. But anecdotally, we know that Black and minority ethnic people are overrepresented within our services, particularly within the night shelters. And actually, looking at the sort of wider homeless sector, there has been a lot of work done looking at the systemic causes of homelessness and how you know, Black and minority ethnic people are often overrepresented within those. So things like people on benefits, you know, there's a proportionally higher number of Black people that are on benefits, and as a result, changes, so things like changes to universal credit and challenges around the benefit cap, which are some of the causes of homelessness, you know, means that they're more likely to be represented within those groups. Then you've got, you know, discrimination, direct discrimination of landlords, and then also unconscious bias. Black and minority ethnic people tend to be overrepresented within social housing. And so, you know, there are a whole lot of kind of systemic reasons when you go back to the causes of homelessness. And it's really at that level, I think, that so many structural issues need to be addressed in order to resolve that.
It's so interesting how this pandemic has thrown up just a number of inequalities, or perhaps the same inequalities but coming at them from different angles. And I think, you know, we're seeing things perhaps through fresh set of lenses as a result of COVID. I know that there is a great deal of work that you're doing in order to kind of create as you put it, new opportunities for listening to your clients and reinventing services. I know that there's anxiety around the coming winter, and I know there are, you know, volunteers and churches really clamoring to know what they're going to be doing next. And sometimes it must be easy for you to either feel overwhelmed or to despair at the problem. And I just wonder if there's a particular passage of the Bible that spurs you on, that gives you hope, or that you kind of keep coming back to again and again when you're in the midst of your vocation to this work.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think there's a particular passage. I mean, there's the obvious passage in Matthew 24 when, you know, Jesus talks about, it was me that was hungry and you gave me food, it was me that was thirsty and you gave me drink, and so on. But I think my kind of Christian upbringing and my, you know, everything that Jesus talks about, all of the parables, so things like the Good Samaritan, you know, it's the person, it's instead of crossing the road when the person that, you know, perhaps smells a bit, or, you know, you're in a hurry to get to an appointment, you know, not just walking on by and ignoring them, and actually kind of crossing the road and talking to them. And, you know, everything that Jesus talks about, taking the, you know, taking the shirt off your back and giving it to someone. I think just that whole kind of framework of teaching, and that ideology of putting yourself in other people's shoes, I think has always kind of driven my desire to want to do good in the world. I know it's an awful cliche, but and that definitely drives me on.
Well, I think from where I'm sitting, you are doing good in the world. However awful a cliche it may be, I think it's not if you're living it out. And thank you so much for all that you do. And we'll look with bated breath to see how the service develops for this winter. In the meantime, we're going to hope to encourage a few people to sleep out, or indeed sleep in this year for glassDoor. So thank you very, very much. God bless you. And we'll be praying for you and your work as the winter comes on.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you and all of your congregation and everybody that's been involved in glassDoor and will continue to be. It's thanks to all of you that we're able to operate, so it's really, really appreciated.
Thank you.